Israel Adesanya's performance at UFC 253 was a timely reminder that Adesanya is one of the best feinters the middleweight division and the rest of the UFC at large has ever seen. Paulo Costa came in with all the braggadocious energy that he could muster, and yet there was no point where it looked like he had any handle on what the stylebender was doing. Before we get into this breakdown, guys, I'd recommend you take a look at my comprehensive guide to Israel Adesanya that I posted earlier in the past week. There, we take a deep, extensive look into the types of feints and shots that Adesanya has generally used throughout his career. Additionally, we did preview this fight here and how Costa's style would clash with Israel's. It's good foundational context for this video. Anyway, guys, here's the breakdown. We talked about in the comprehensive guide how Paulo Costa's game revolves around moving in on his opponent, pushing them to the cage, and then working his combinations both to the head and body when he has them on the fence. The thing is though, that most of his previous opponents have had pretty poor lateral movement, and many of them have relied almost purely on blitzing to get them off the cage. In this instance, Bambos should move out to his right to get back into the center of the cage, but, well, he doesn't. He ends up on his back. In this fight, Israel immediately came out and started showing jab feints and moving side to side. This way, Costa couldn't push him back just casually. And then came the kicks and the kick feints. Israel loves to push his rear hip out to feint that low kick, and he started doing it immediately. Costa is generally quite heavy on his lead leg, and thus Israel's leg kicking was effective from the onset. Costa taunted him for this first kick, but he couldn't check or pull back from it, and immediately pulled his leg back on the next hip feint that Israel showed, so make of that what you will. When Costa started feinting himself and threatening to move forward to crowd Israel, that's when we saw Israel start using the oblique kick. He hasn't used it all that often in previous fights, but it was in constant usage here. By kicking right above or directly on the knee of the lead leg, you stunt your opponent's forward progression because, if they keep moving forward into the kick, they'll blow their knee out. Just ask Rampage Jackson after fighting John Jones. Costa's lacking footwork was fully exposed midway through the first round. While Costa was being more patient than usual, there's no way to deny that even when he stepped forward, he wasn't able to put Israel square on the fence in the immobile positions that Uriah Hall, Johnny Hendricks and Yoel Romero found themselves in. Israel's feinting caused the ever-anxious Costa to move back every single time. As we talked about in the preview, Costa has a habit of being overly defensive when in the middle of the cage. Uriah started firing off jabs periodically when actually given some space by Costa, and each jab caused Costa to either shell up completely or pull his head back all the way to avoid the strike. His inability to consistently simultaneously counter hurt him dearly in this contest, as when he pulled back his head because of Israel's jab feint, he would have his leg punted out from underneath him. We also talked about how many southpaws Costa has fought in his UFC career thus far, and how this has enhanced his ability to land the body kick. In the open stance matchup that you get when an orthodox fighter takes on a southpaw, there is a clear path for body kicks with the rear leg. So when you have a massive, powerful kicker like Costa, who knows how to turn his hip over to generate crazy kicking power, that open stance matchup can be a killer. Thus, it's no surprise Israel went southpaw very few times. Even when he did switch stance, it was often only to immediately hit the straight left into the left high kick, or just to cut an angle to get off of the cage. When Costa did have the opportunity to throw that body kick to the open side, Israel was often outside of range and able to avoid damage. There were some kicks which landed to the body, but for the most part, Israel was able to catch these and counter off of them. Thought I had leading into this contest was that Costa had really only a single range or area of the cage he could win in. There was never any chance Costa was going to win a kickboxing fight with Israel Adesanya out in the middle of the cage. As we saw with the finish, Costa couldn't even jab without being countered. The double attack from southpaw perplexed him and he couldn't get a grasp on the kicks. Israel would often stand with his hips relatively square so he could hold his rear hand out and catch or control Costa's lead hand, and this forced Costa's attention away from Adesanya's jab, as well as preventing Costa from jabbing cleanly himself. Really, his only effective offense from the center were kicks of his own, but he couldn't get many off confidently before the threat of Adesanya countering made him tentative to go back to them again. And then, as we saw when Costa did press forward, Israel had the advantage in the clinch. Israel's single or double collar tie is both a defensive and an offensive engagement. Thus, Costa had to win this fight on the fence, flurrying effectively and avoiding getting pulled into the clinch where he couldn't land his biggest shots. That's all quite a tall task. And ultimately, it was too much for the Brazilian slugger. Israel landed a significant high kick from southpaw before avoiding some big lead hand shots expertly, and he finished the fight with a left hook after slipping Costa's jab. No matter how you feel about the post-fight antics, you can't deny that Israel Adesanya is the best middleweight in the world at present. With Whittaker versus Cannonier confirmed officially for UFC 254, we can only assume that the winner of that contest might very well get the next opportunity to challenge for the belt, and if that's the case, neither is a cakewalk for Israel, despite the fact that he's already dispatched of Whittaker once before. But for the time being, take the opportunity to appreciate Israel Adesanya whilst he's here and doing what he did so effortlessly the other night.